Hello, one and all, and welcome back to another thrilling episode of U.S. Government. Today, we are going to be talking about voter behavior trends. That means the ways that people vote and the reasons why they vote. We're going to take a look at some statistical trends. Okay, I want to note that in this section of the notes, you're going to be having some fill in the blanks, but you're also going to be looking at some graphics with me. You're going to circle things based off of what we see in some different charts. If you get stuck, if you're not sure, you can always ask me in person. I'd be happy to answer. But again, the notes look a little bit different today. The other thing that I want to talk about is how we are looking at generalities. We're going to be looking at different groups of people, and it's important to note that you can't treat one group of people all the same. They don't represent everybody in that group. We're just going to be looking at trends, which means that just because someone is over the age of 60, they may not vote as the same way as everybody else over the age of 60. So it's important to know that people are individuals, and we're just looking at trends. To get started, we are going to be looking at education levels. And we see a chart here of different education levels of people and how that corresponds with their voting track records. What we notice is that education tends to increase people's understanding of abstract ideas. So as we look at these three different groups, people who have less than a high school degree, people who have graduated high school, and people who have at least attended some college, we're going to see that there are different voter turnout rates. And the group with the most is the people who are the most educated, which means that the more education someone has, the more likely they are to vote. Okay. Regarding who they are voting for, we also see some trends and correlations. This is data from the 2016 election. I like the way that this one looked, how it's nice and clean, and there's not a whole lot of too much information on here. So even though this was a little while ago, the trend still holds true today. So we're not going to worry about changing it because the graph is nice and clean. But as we kind of look, we're going to see, again, kind of the same groups. High school or less education, some college education, college graduate, and postgraduate degree, which means a doctorate, or someone might be a lawyer. And we notice that generally speaking, as people become more educated, they are more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. That's the Democratic, which means that the more education someone has, the more liberal they tend to be. So again, you would circle that liberal choice in your notes there. The more education someone has, the more liberal they tend to be. Let's look at money. Okay, as family income changes, so does voter turnout rates. And we can see this one pretty clearly, how the more money that someone has, the more likely they are to turn out to go vote. It's pretty cut and dry, and there's a pretty simple reason behind this too. As people start to make more money, they are more likely to be salaried, which means that they don't get paid by the hour anymore. If you're making less than $10,000 a year making sandwiches or fast food or whatever it is, you would have to miss a shift in order to go vote, because in America we don't have a voting holiday, which means that if you go to vote, it might actually cost you money in the long run, because that's an hour that you're not getting paid for at your job. So if you're making less money, you're less likely to vote. Now, in what seems like a contradiction to our education levels, what we see is that the more money that you make, we actually see the opposite effect of education. The more money that you make, the less likely you are to be liberal, and the more likely you are to be conservative. So the more money you make, the more likely you are to be conservative. It might seem like education and income go hand in hand. Sometimes it does. But when it comes to voting rates, the more conservative the more income someone has, the more conservative they tend to be. That has to do a lot with the conservative/Republican approach to taxes. A lot of times, the people who have lots and lots of money don't want to pay taxes for social welfare programs, which is something that the Democrats believe in. If you don't have that much money, you'd be much more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate, because they tend to advocate for things that are going to help you out. We're going to skip this slide and move on to race and ethnicity. All right, we've got 4 different ethnic groups here, represented by the 4 different lines. And race and ethnicity, we see, statistically speaking, does have an impact on whether or not people tend to vote. We notice that the group that is voting the most is non-Hispanic white people, and the group that is least likely to vote is Hispanic people. Okay, so the group that is least likely to vote there is Hispanic folks. When it breaks down to party affiliation, you'll notice, just like what we talked about in the last lesson, most people are here in the middle and not officially a Democrat or a Republican. Most people are independent or don't know. But if we take a look at which party they prefer, if they chose a party, we see that Caucasian or non-Hispanic white people tend to be Republican, which means they tend to be conservative. And every ethnic minority group here tends to favor Democrats over Republicans, non-Hispanic black people by a large margin. But again, the white folks tend to be Republican, and ethnic minorities tend to be Democrat or liberal. Okay, let's move on to age. How old you are might have an impact on how you vote. We see it again and again and again going back more than 30, 40 years. We notice that young people tend to vote at much lower rates than the elderly do. So the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. That's because you tend to care about more things, and you can kind of take a longer view on the world necessarily than the average 18-year-old can. Okay. We've got a breakdown of some different generations of Americans here. And when this was taken, Gen Z was not at voting age yet, nor was Gen Alpha. But again, just like the other charts, this one is nice and clean, and the trends hold true to today. So as people get older, they tend to be more conservative. That has to do with how older people tend to not like change as much as younger people do, and also older people are more likely to have higher incomes than younger people are. So the older you are, the more likely you are to be conservative. We got two more categories, or maybe this is the last one. We've got gender, which does have a slight statistical difference in how people vote. We notice that women tend to vote at slightly higher rates than men do. Over the past 40 years, women vote at slightly higher rates than men do. And again, generally speaking, we also kind of see a breakdown between the two genders for who they're voting for, whereas men tend to vote for the Republican candidate, the conservative side. Men tend to be conservative. Women tend to be liberal and support the Democratic side. Okay. Getting away from the charts, we're just kind of breaking down things here. We also notice that where people live has an effect on them. Democrats tend to get more votes in the East and the West coasts. They also tend to get votes up in the Pacific Northwest and in urban areas or in cities. A lot of people in cities do use those social welfare programs that the Democrats are fond of, so the Democrats tend to win over a lot of people in cities. Whereas Republicans tend to win over a lot of votes in the South, where Christianity especially has a large impact on people's lives and the culture there. We say the Midwest is also a Republican hotspot, and lots of small towns and country areas tend to vote Republican too. All right, let's break down a little bit more about the different Democrat and Republican values. Remember that we talked about the platforms yesterday. Today, we're going to kind of talk about the deeper issues behind them. So we said liberals tend to be Democrats. Democrats like the liberal approach to social issues where the government should get involved. They also tend to be more tolerant of diversity, whether it's ethnicity, different views, different religions, different sexual orientations. Democrats tend to be more tolerant. They also believe the government should get involved. This is another reason why they tend to get more minority voters, because they tend to advocate for more civil rights laws. They mostly believe that religion should be separated from the government. We call that the separation of church and state. And they believe that taxes should be used to improve education, healthcare, and other social welfare programs that we talked about yesterday. They believe in general that minority groups who have been treated poorly in the past could use some extra protection and special help today in the present. That's an idea called affirmative action, that we're helping out previously disadvantaged groups in the present today to help close the inequality gap. They argue that big businesses needed to be monitored and regulated by the federal government, and that the government should act to reduce global warming. Republicans, however, tend to get a lot of the conservative votes. They attract the conservative ideas. They want to protect traditional U.S. values and way of life. Remember, they don't like change. They tend to have more of an emphasis on religion, and especially on Christianity. The idea of one nation under God comes to mind. That's not something that's always been part of America's money or part of the Pledge of Allegiance. That was added by a Republican president in the 50s. They argue that states' rights should be protected from big government, and big government should let states make choices for themselves. That taxes should be kept as low as possible, and that individuals, if they have to pay less taxes, they would be better equipped to take care of themselves. They argue that minority groups do not need this special treatment that I mentioned. They don't need affirmative action because that just creates more inequality in the present. They say that regardless of how people have been treated in the past, all Americans should be treated equally in the present. They argue that businesses should be free to make money the ways that they wish, and that the federal government should stay out of it. Finally, they argue that global warming is not fully understood, and that the government shouldn't waste money on environmental action. Okay. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to take a look at these different categories in your notes and these different sentences, and you're going to put D's and R's after each one of them. Okay. If you need help with this, please reach out, but you'll do it here for policy differences and also demographic differences. All right. Thank you so much for paying attention, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great day.